designed to focus you only on the bits and pieces in the record that Todd McNair and our lawyers want you to focus on, and to ignore all the things that undermine their case. Second, what you heard and what you've been hearing from Mr. McNair's counsel for 3 weeks is designed to take your focus away from the actual evidence, away from what people actually said from this chair or on this TV, and to assumptions, suggestions of things they can't possibly prove, things on which they are relying solely on what counsel tells you. And third, what you heard today was designed to inflame your emotion. You heard counsel say that the NCAA hung Todd McNair, that they hung this around his neck. I don't know what counsel meant by that, but I know it was designed to inflame you. What I want to do in my time is not to inflame you, is not to focus only on the parts of the case that are good for my client, but to try, to the best of my ability, to walk you through what's actually in the evidence in the case, what actually happened, and to try to relate that to what you're going to be asked to decide. There's only one claim that you're being asked to decide. It's defamation. You started talking about some other stuff, but as it comes to you, it's defamation. Now I'm going to focus my time on that, and all those questions that you're going to be asked to decide are about that. And I want to begin here. Actually, I want to begin by going back to the very first thing I told you when I stood up in opening. I told you a couple things. Number one, we admit that this process was not perfect. You know that some mistakes were made in the interviews of Lake and Lake and McNair. We haven't hidden from that. We haven't denied that. And you know some people wrote some side emails among each other that they shouldn't have written. But what I told you at the outset was that this case comes down to what the committee found, what evidence they had, and what conclusions they reached in this report. And we've given you a chance, as much as we could, to meet these people. Because in order to believe their case, these are the 8 people whose names are on the report. These people are villains. These people are evil. And these people intentionally ruined Todd McNair's life and career. That's what they're asking you to believe. I think counsel just argued to you that every single committee member who testified before you was a liar. We wanted you to meet them because we wanted you to judge them for yourselves. You met Brian Halloran, volunteers for this committee, even though he doesn't work at an NCAA school, who served for years as a coordinator of appeals, although in this case he was a voting member. He told you why he did it. Why he took time out of his life, because he believes in the rules and he believes in a level playing field. You heard from Dennis Thomas, who had himself been an assistant coach, and then a head coach, and then an athletic director. He'd even been an All-American when he was playing football at Alcorn State. He told you he got on this committee because he wanted to make sure that it would be fair. And he wanted to bring his experience as a coach to these issues. You heard from Joe Patuto, who had been on the committee, already done the maximum amount she could, 3 terms, a total of 9 years. She explained why she gave that much of her life to volunteering for the NCAA. And you heard from Eleanor Myers, from Temple University, Coach McNair's own alma mater. This person that, if you were to believe their case, was bullied and had her arms twisted. You got to judge her.
I'm sorry?
You got to judge her. You got to see her in person. And you heard about the other members who, for various reasons, couldn't be here, including Paul D, who's passed. In order to find for Todd McNair, you have to think that these people were in a conspiracy with each other and with, I suppose, Rada Poff and Roscoe Howard and Shep Cooper, and I suppose with the 4 members of the appeals committee, and I suppose even with Dr. Emmert, the head of the NCAA. I just want you to apply your common sense to what they're asking you to conclude about these people. I began in my opening by focusing on you on the 2 basic findings in this case. This is on page 23 of the report. The report is Exhibit 61. And the findings they made were that Todd McNair, who they described as assistant football coach, had knowledge that Bush and Lake and Michaels likely were engaged in NCAA violations, and that he knew that at least by the date of that middle of the night call. And they found that Todd McNair provided false and misleading information when asked about that. And I talked about this in opening as the committee's bottom line, that McNair knew that Bush likely got improper benefits and that McNair did not tell the truth. And you've seen the information, the interviews, the records, the hearing transcript, and the other things the committee had when it got to this bottom line. If you review those same materials, if you apply your common sense to them and decide that the bottom line was reasonable, then the NCAA should win this case. Because if the bottom line was reasonable, then no one in that committee defamed Todd McNair. Now, we're going to be talking mostly about this report, Exhibit 61, the Committee on Infractions report, but there are 2 other statements that you'll also be asked to evaluate. First is what Mark Emmert said. It's quoted in this article. The exhibit is 848, and that'll be identified for you on the verdict form. And he's quoted. Counsel said he said it at a press conference. That's just flat wrong. He was interviewed, I believe, by a reporter, and he was asked a question that had nothing to really do with this case. He was just asked a question about why does it take the NCAA so long sometimes? Because you remember, it did take them a long time in this case. Todd McNair, USC had 5 years of process. And some people were critical that it took so long, and so what Mark Emmert said was everyone looks at the Reggie Bush case and says it took them a long while, but they got it right, I think. It was a very hard, complex case. That, they want you to believe, was a defamatory statement about Todd McNair, even though it doesn't even mention Coach McNair, or a running back coach, or an assistant football coach. And the third thing is the appeals committee report. They're now saying that's defamation too. That's exhibit 110. That's the third thing you're going to be asked to look at. Now, the appeals committee didn't make any additional findings about Todd McNair. It heard arguments from Mr. McNair and his counsel. It looked at the text of the first report. It quoted portions of it because it had to. The argument was about what was written in the first report. And it made two basic observations that this issue came down to witness credibility. What Lloyd Lake said versus what Todd McNair said. And when the appeals committee looked at the evidence, they found that the evidence was sufficient to find Lake to be the more credible party. So those are the three statements. You know, you've seen a lot of emails. I'll talk about them. I'm not going to hide from them. You've seen a lot of information. But at the end of this case, at the end of the day, this case is about these three documents. And everything you're going to be asked to decide is premised on these three documents. Now, the other thing I told you in opening is that we do not dispute that Coach McNair has fallen on hard times. We do not dispute that. What we disagree with, what we question, is why. You know from the evidence that Coach McNair got the lightest penalty he possibly could. You know that over the last 8 years, he's had minimal outreach to NFL and college, even though there are over 700 jobs, 700 football programs between the two of them. You know a little bit about his history with dogs, and let me just pause on this and say that we've talked about that as little as possible, because it is a distraction in some ways. And you've heard more about it from plaintiff than you have from us. But we know that Mr. McNair disagrees with what happened in his history was reported in the Times, LA and New York. And we know that even though it's old, it came up at his Cardinals interview in 2013. And when he didn't get that job at Temple, what counsel in his opening called the straw that broke the camel's back, we know that Coach McNair went and posted online and talked about clearing something up with his attorneys, and it wasn't the NCAA sanction. It was that history. So fairly or unfairly, that's something that's followed Coach McNair around. And we also know, because you've heard multiple witnesses say it, including their own expert, that other coaches who get these kind of penalties and sanctions move on. Not only to good jobs, but to some of the same jobs. Coach McNair said he reached out to Seattle, and he had an interview with Arizona in the NFL. You heard Dr. Fermuzes admit that both of those teams have hired coaches with unethical conduct. So how can we just conclude that it must be because of what these reports say that Coach McNair is in a different situation? We don't have to guess about it because he told us. And I'm going to talk a fair bit about the testimony you heard from Coach McNair. And I'm not going to do what counsel did. I'm not going to tell you that, counsel said Coach McNair is the best witness and all the NCAA witnesses, they're not worth a sack of potatoes. They're liars. They're unethical. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to do that about Coach McNair. I think we should look, and you should look at what everyone said. But I asked Coach McNair, the very first day his show cause penalty began to run, he went out to the world and said, my career's over. And he filed his lawsuit. And I asked him, Coach McNair, you knew if you tried too hard to get a job, you couldn't come into this court and claim that this was a career-ending sanction? He said, yeah, that's fair. Those are things you're going to have to consider when, if you get to those later questions that counsel breezed through and said, oh, yeah. There's a substantial factor, there are damages in this case, there's causation. It's not that simple. But there are two other points I want to make before we get to the lunch break, because the way this falls to me, I have to do this before and after lunch. Number one, you've heard so much in this trial about the NCAA being like cops or prosecutors. Bring it up in voir dire, bring it up in opening with every witness, even now in closing. And I submit to you that counsel's doing that intentionally and doing it to confuse you. Because the prosecutors have the burden of proof, and the prosecutors have to meet the highest burden, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And of course, to get there, they have actual police. They have actual police powers. You can get search warrants and tab calls and all the kind of things that the NCAA couldn't possibly do. In this case, the burden on everything you have to find is on Todd McNair. You remember in voir dire when we talked about we begin the race even, and if we end the race even, then you have to move with the NCAA. On all of these elements, that the statements were false, that the NCAA acted with malice, that it's the statements and not Mr. McNair's choices that caused his harm, on the amount of actual damages, if there even are any, and on his right to get even more money, because apparently 27 million is not enough, so on his right to get even more money in punitive damages. On all of those things, Mr. McNair and his counsel have to win the race. Otherwise, you say no and we go home. And on two of these things, that I'll talk about malice and the right to punitive, they don't just have to win the race, they have to blow us out. Because they have to prove that by clear and convincing evidence, which means they must persuade you that it's highly probable that the NCAA acted with malice, highly probable that they have a right to punitive damages. So here's the last point I want to make before our break. It'll be over the course of the next 3 slides. When you're evaluating the evidence in this case and the arguments, please consider what Mr. McNair and his counsel have focused on and what they are avoiding. What are they relying on? They're relying on Mr. McNair's say-so. He did testify here for 2 days. And you heard him. I want to be fair. You heard him turn around and look at you and say that he didn't know about the benefits and that he didn't lie. I'm not asking you to forget about that. But I will be asking you to put it in the context of everything else we know. They're relying on misleading sound bites. How many times have you heard recklessly constructed rhetoric? botched interview. It's like counsel wants to sear it into your brain. But they never talk about how the statements were actually made, what's actually said in the rest of the email, what the witnesses said about those statements. They want you to forget that and just run with the sound bites. And they rely on unproven assumptions. You know, this whole thing about they wanted to get Todd McNair to increase the penalties on USC, there is not one thing anyone said from that witness chair or from the videos that actually supports that. People swore up and down, under oath, under penalty of perjury, that had nothing to do with Todd McNair. And they have their entire damages case, their entire case about causation is built on assumptions. Their own expert said he didn't care whether those were wrong. And finally, what they rely on is arguments and questions by counsel. How many times in this case has counsel told you to believe something without a single witness telling you? Lloyd Lake was drunk or high. We said that. Counsel. Counsel's the only one. How many times did they say, oh, it was loud in the club when they had this phone call? That is made up. You know, they said malarkey? That's malarkey because no witness told you. And not only is it malarkey, but when counsel does that, he is asking you to violate the oath that every one of you took to serve on this jury. Because the instructions say that what the attorneys say during trial is not evidence. Their statements and arguments are not evidence. And the attorney's questions are not evidence. Only the witness's answers are evidence. How many times did we hear counsel ask a question 5, 10, 15 times in these depositions? They didn't play that for you for the answers. They want you to just forget the answers and just think the questions are what was proven. How many times did they ask a question and then withdraw it before there was even an answer? You don't care about what it said on this witness stand. Their star witness isn't Todd McNair. Their star witness is counsel. And that is simply not something or someone you can listen to when we're talking about what the evidence is. And the last point I want to make before our lunch break is, what does Mr. McNair ignore? What does his team ignore? They ignore the evidence in context. I'm going to talk about that word, because context means you look at the big picture. You don't say, oh, I can explain away these 3 calls to Lloyd Lake. Oh, I can explain over here why I was in a photograph and don't remember it. Oh, I can explain away this other call in January. You have to line things up together. Look at the big picture and then ask yourself what makes sense, and they are desperately avoiding that. Mr. McNair and his team ignore the many changes in his own story. If you're telling the truth, your story doesn't have to change from the first interview to the second interview to the hearing to the courtroom, but I'll show you that it did repeatedly change. And they're ignoring his selective amnesia. That's a mouthful, but what I mean by that is this. I agree with counsel that memories fade over time. I agree that we can't remember what happened 3 years ago as well as what we remember about yesterday. That's not suspicious. But what is suspicious is when someone has perfect recollection of things that happened more than a decade ago when it helps them, but when it doesn't help them, that person doesn't remember a thing. And we'll talk about that, because that is what Todd McNair did and said on the witness stand. When it helped him, he remembered it perfectly. When it hurt him, can't remember. And finally, what Mr. McNair and his team ignore, and have ignored from the day we started until today, is his burden to actually prove something to you, rather than just throw sound bites, snippets, and argument from counsel. Have a good lunch, and I'll pick it up there.
All right.
Good lunch? want to do now is go through the verdict form with you and discuss the evidence that goes to the questions that you're going to have to answer. Now, I'm not going to put any check marks on this. That's going to be your job. But I do want to give each question some time and focus on them because they're each separate questions. And Mr. McNair has the burden on all of them. You can't get to a question on this form unless you answer the previous question yes. You're going to see that. And I want to talk a little bit about how this is going to work for you, how this verdict form works, because I think this is the hardest part to explain. We spend 3 weeks in this case here presenting evidence and arguing to you. But we don't spend a lot of time explaining to you what it is you're actually going to be asked to decide. And so this verdict form works in the following way. This is the first question. Did the NCAA make any statements of fact about Todd McNair, the persons other than Todd McNair, in any of the following? And it lists these 3 documents that I've been talking about. So Exhibit 61, that's the Committee on Infractions report that we spent most of our focus on. Exhibit 848 is the USA Today article that quotes Mark Emmert. And Exhibit 110 is the Appeals Committee report about Mr. McNair. So these are the documents, these are the statements that you have to evaluate in going through the verdict form. And here's a part that I want to emphasize. You start with 3. But if you get to a question, and it may be the first one, and you decide that one of those statements doesn't satisfy the question, let's just say, this is just an example, you decide that the statement of Mark Emmert isn't a yes. It isn't a statement of fact, for example. Then when you go to the next question, you take this exhibit and you forget about it. Because question 2, you're only focused on the documents that satisfy question 1. So if that is how it happens, by the time you get to question 2, you'll be down to 2 documents. Then you'll answer question 2. Again, if either of the 2 documents is a yes on question 2, you keep going in with it. But if something drops out, once it drops out, it doesn't come back in. That's what I'm trying to explain. And if you ever get to a question, and whatever document or documents are left, you decide the answer is no, you decide to check a no box on any of these questions, then you stop there and you go home. Because Mr. McNair has to prove to you that the answer is yes on all of these questions about these statements before he can get $27 million or before he can get 1 red cent. So let me start with this first question. And I've highlighted a couple things here. These have to be statements of fact about Todd McNair. And one of them isn't. This is a jury instruction that's in your packet, and it talks about the difference between a fact and an opinion. For Todd McNair to recover, the NCAA statements must have been statements of fact, not opinion. And the reason for that is everyone in this country is entitled to their opinion, and no one can sue you for it. You can think whatever you want to think, and you can tell the world what it is you think, and no one can sue you for it. Here's what Mark Emmert said. Everyone looks at the Reggie Bush case and says it took them a long time, but they got it right, I think. It was a very hard, complex case. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Mr. Emmert's opinion. And of course, you know he wasn't in the deliberations, he wasn't one of the committee members, he wasn't knee-deep in this. He knew about it from a distance, and he had an opinion. Just like anyone reading the newspaper might have had an opinion about the USC matter. And this statement isn't even about Todd McNair. It's about the Reggie Bush case. Sure, in the NCAA, Mr. McNair was part of that, but this is an opinion, and it doesn't even discuss Todd McNair. So I submit to you question one. At question one, you should set aside this document, Exhibit A48. And going forward, you should just focus on the other two, because this is an opinion, not a fact. Any of you can say what you think, and so can Mark Emmert. That's not against the law. And if you have any, if you're not convinced by that, if you somehow think Mr. McNair has proven that Emmert's statement is a statement of fact, it would still fail at question two. Because you have to ask yourself, did the people to whom these statements were made reasonably understand that any of the statements were about Todd McNair? Let's look at it again. Everyone looks at the Reggie Bush case and says it took them a long time, but they got it right, I think. It was a very hard, complex case. If I pulled any of you guys off the street 4 weeks ago and read you that statement, would you think it was about Todd McNair? Honest question. So certainly by the second question, although I think by the first, you should set this statement aside and focus on what really matters, which is the findings of the committees. Now we get to question number 3. With respect to the statements for which you answered yes in question 2, so again, only the things that got past 1 and 2, with respect to them, were any of the statements false? And here is a point where I want to emphasize something to you, because I think it might have been a little bit confusing earlier today. There is no question who has to prove the statements were false. This is from the instructions. Todd McNair must prove the statements were false. He must prove. If after listening to all the evidence, you're just not sure, if after listening to all the evidence, you're just not sure what was really discussed on that call between Lake and McNair, if after seeing everything you've seen in this case, you just don't know who to believe, then you have to answer this question no. And we go home. Because Todd McNair would not have proven any false statements to you. Now, this is one of those areas where, in order to evaluate the evidence, I'm asking you to step back and look at a big picture. Mr. McNair and his team have attacked Lloyd Lake about as many ways as you can attack a human being. They called him a gangbanger. They talked about how he broke his girlfriend's arm. They say he had all these nefarious motives, although he never sued Todd McNair. And they talk about the fact that people like Dennis Thomas didn't just take Lloyd Lake at his word. That's a good thing. What Dennis Thomas told you was he looked at the evidence and asked himself whether that evidence supported Lake or supported McNair. Dennis Thomas didn't judge the person. He judged the evidence. Plaintiffs want you to judge the person. And they're telling you this person is a worthless human being. The problem with that theory is, without Lloyd Lake, none of us would know what Reggie Bush had done. Remember, everyone today agrees that Reggie Bush broke the rules and took hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits. But the only reason we know that is because Lloyd Lake told the truth about it to the NCAA. And you can't just ignore that, because it doesn't make common sense. If Lloyd Lake told the truth about Reggie Bush, surely that's something you should consider in evaluating his statements about Todd McNair. And of course, he provided evidence of Bush's benefits that we've described to you, and I'm not going to spend too much time on. And even USC agreed that Lloyd Lake was credible on a number of things. That's what Eleanor Myers told you, and we know that's a fact because USC didn't fight back on all of the findings about Reggie Bush's benefits. So think about that. Even the school that lost a national championship, lost all those scholarships, had postseason ban. Even they said Lake was credible on a number of things. Surely that counts for something. So then we turn to, what did Lake say about McNair? You know, he brought up Todd McNair's name on his own. He knew him as the running back coach. He knew him as Coach McNair. He even knew him by his nickname, T-Mac. He said they met at a party in San Diego. He said they were together at the club, and he provided the photograph to show it. And he discussed their phone calls. This is information that the committee had. And as they do in every case, they had to decide whether it was believable. And when they did that, they considered all the circumstances, including what Todd McNair told them at the hearing and told us again from the witness stand. Communication with your players is paramount. True, he said. You need to be the conscience for them as much as you could. I do and I did. Todd McNair says he didn't turn a blind eye. He looked for these kind of things. Well, if he looked, it wouldn't have been hard to find. And you know that the evidence does support Lake. You know, they've chopped it up and they've looked for every imperfection, every deviation, everything they could do to pull it apart. But there's no arguing some basic facts. On the same night in 2005, McNair called Lake 3 times and then they're in the picture together. That's a fact. And it's a fact that Lloyd Lake called McNair at 1:34 in the morning on January 8th, 2006, and Coach McNair stayed on, picked up that call and stayed on for 2.5 minutes. That's a fact. And we know that it wasn't just Lloyd Lake's work. Now, I agree with counsel. Maisha Jones, the ex-girlfriend, she wasn't there in the room for the call. I've never tried to suggest otherwise. There were only 2 people who can tell us what was on that call, and that's Lake and McNair. But she did say that around this time, Lloyd Lake was calling people, and he told her he was calling people. Somebody better talk to Reggie or this is going to go public. I'm not going to lose my money. That tends to support Lake's story. He's desperate and he's trying to get his money back. And you also know that Todd McNair has some kind of link to every single person who paid benefits to Bush. The photograph, the calls with Lake. Michaels is in that photograph. And even Michael Ornstein. Now the committee didn't find on this as to Todd McNair. It wasn't presented that way, but we know that he spoke with Ornstein, who was a separate improper provider of benefits
On phone calls, he knew about the internship. He said he was interning for a flunky, whatever that meant, and he acknowledged knowing Ornstein. There's no other coach at USC who's linked to all three of these people. It's fair to consider that as part of the big picture. You know, anything I put up in one of these slides, standing on its own, may not prove a whole lot. But when you stack it up, it does. Especially when you consider that it's Coach McNair's burden to prove to you that the statements and the findings are false. And you know, it's interesting, the council has referred to common sense because common sense is on the NCAA side in this case. And I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking to you about that. Let's start, pardon me, let's start with that night of October 29, 2005. Is it possible that Todd McNair just called Broillet 3 times because it's a number he got from Reggie Bush and he didn't know who he was calling? I'll give him that much. It's possible. Is it possible that Todd McNair was photographed with Broillet and Mike Michaels, but didn't really know them? Standing alone, you know what? I'll give you that. But as Dennis Thomas said, what are the odds that it both happened on the same night? To believe Mr. McNair's story, you would have to believe that on the same night he happened to call a man he didn't know 3 times. On that same night he's photographed with that man and his business partner, his partner in bringing down Reggie Bush and USC. What are the odds? Just ask you to apply your common sense to it. And this night of October 29, 2005, that's the night Percy Harvin, the most important recruit in Coach McNair's career, is in town. And this night is one of those examples of what I describe or call selective amnesia. You see, I'm not faulting Coach McNair or any other witness for not having a perfect memory. But what is suspicious is when someone remembers everything that helps them try to talk out of a problem and remembers nothing about the evidence that goes against them. I submit to you, you saw that selective amnesia in action from this chair when Coach McNair testified. He's asked what was going on with Reggie Bush that night. Why didn't he pick up Percy Harvin? The night in question is October 29, 2005. We are now in 2018. That's 13 years ago, and he had perfect recollection. He said, he quoted Reggie on what Reggie told him on a phone call that night. I remember him saying, my phone is dying, my phone is dying. Perfect recollection of what Reggie Bush told him on the night of October 29, 2005. But on cross-examination, when I asked him, well, did you go back to the hotel and get Percy? I really don't recall that night. From the hotel on, I don't remember. Isn't that convenient? From the hotel on, I don't remember. Perfect memory of the phone call to Reggie Bush. No recollection of what was said in the phone calls to Lloyd. Perfect memory of why Reggie told him to call another phone number. No recollection of whether he went back to the hotel to get the star recruit, the only guy who could replace Reggie Bush. It's that inconsistency. I'm not criticizing the lack of memory. What I'm criticizing is that inconsistency between a perfect recollection to explain things away and no recollection when he doesn't have an explanation. And we've talked a lot about the other call. 1:34 in the morning from Lloyd Lake to Todd McNair on January 8, 2006. We know the call happened, we know the direction, we know the dates. We know who called who. And we know that Coach McNair picked up and stayed on the line for 2:30. Now, as I said, there's only two people who can tell us, really, what went on between Lake and McNair, and it's the two of them. What did Lloyd Lake tell investigators about Coach McNair? He didn't just say he told them for the first time in that phone call. He said, I wanted him to know that Reggie was involved, to let him in on some action. He knew Reggie took money from me, there's no doubt about that. And he listed the ways in which he knew, which actually will continue that quote in another slide in a few minutes. And then here's what the NCAA got from Todd McNair. This is his second interview. You know, in the first interview he said, I don't know, I'm not sure, not to my recollection have I ever talked with Lloyd Lake. But in the second interview, that went from no recollection to I am dead certain that I didn't do it. I don't know Lloyd Lake, I've never spoken to Lloyd Lake, I did not call him, I didn't talk to Lloyd Lake, I didn't see Lloyd Lake. Every way he could, Coach McNair took all of his chips and put them in the middle of the table. And what he bet on was, I don't know who Lloyd Lake is. That was his story. I've never met him, I've never talked to him. And that's what he offered up to investigators. So they had to compare that to what they had heard from Lloyd Lake. And when the case made it to the committee believed Lake. And here's something Dr. Thomas said that I don't know if it resonated with you, but it resonated with me. A convicted felon can tell the truth, just like a pillar of the community can lie. You don't judge the person, you judge the evidence. That's how you decide who's telling the truth. You don't say, gangbanger, forget you. You judge the evidence. And Brian Halloran said that Mr. McNair's explanation was less credible than the alternative explanation, which is the one given by Lake. And what did Dennis Thomas say? Because what I want to get to now is the explanation that Todd McNair eventually landed upon. Not right away, but by the hearing, he did have an explanation for this call, even though he claims he doesn't remember. And his explanation was there were some agent meetings the next day. Must have been about that. So there's a few things I want to ask you about that, and this is one of those areas where I am not just asking you, but begging you to use your common sense. If Todd McNair doesn't know Lloyd Lake, if Lloyd Lake is some random dude calling to get in on a panel in a day and a half, and that call comes in at 1:34 in the morning, that's a quick hang-up. What? Who are you? Call me back in the morning. It's a normal time to somebody to call and introduce themselves and try to set up a meeting. Anyone ever call you at 1:34 in the morning to try to propose some kind of business arrangement with you? Some kind of attendance at a meeting? And of course, we know what was going on with Lloyd Lake. This is not in dispute. We know he wanted his money back. No one disputes that. We know he was about to go back to jail. The call is on January 8th. Lake's back in jail on January 18th. He's got 10 days to bail this thing out. And the clock is ticking. And we know he was desperate. So, what counsel has suggested is that if the call really was anything to do with benefits, Todd McNair would have blown up the phone that night. I think his counsel argued that, and I think Coach McNair told you that. But But consider all the evidence you heard. Coach McNair has been in touch with Lloyd Lake at least since October of the previous year. And now he gets a call, and according to Lake, Lake is threatening to go public. What Rod Alphoff told you here, I think is spot on. Todd McNair may have been in a very difficult position. You think it would be easy for Coach McNair to call up Pete Carroll at 2 a.m. that morning and say, "Hi, Coach Carroll, our best player, who's my responsibility, has been on the take for the better part of a year. And the guys paying him are people I know and have been photographed with." Todd McNair was in a very tough position that night. And he took a calculated risk that Lake was bluffing. And Lake wouldn't go through the risk. And the problem with that is that Lake wasn't bluffing. This is a timeline that I want to take a minute to explain. We covered it when I was asking Coach McNair some questions, but I really want to explain it. You see, 3 days before Coach McNair is interviewed for the first time by the NCAA, Yahoo prints an article, Yahoo Sports. It's a sports publication that's broken a lot of scandals in sports over the years, including this one. And Yahoo writes on September 16th that 2 sources claimed USC assistant Todd McNair knew of New Era, that's Lake's company's relationship with Bush. This is 2005. Coach McNair is suing the NCAA for publicly linking him with Bush and the violations. Yahoo did that 5 years before the NCAA issued their report. But not only do they say that, oh, by the way, one other point, when I asked Coach McNair who he thinks the 2 sources were, he didn't hesitate. He said, Lake and Michaels. Same guys in the picture. And the Yahoo story says this has been an 8-month investigation. Story comes out September 16th. 8 months before that is January 16th. In that little window between when Lake called McNair and when Lake went back to jail. So you see, folks, Lake wasn't bluffing. He did go to the press. Only the press didn't just say, "Oh, hi, ex-con Lloyd Lake, you say Todd McNair knew, let's run a story the next morning on the sports ticker." They did the responsible thing and did an 8-month investigation. And only when they were comfortable, they issued the story. Not that different than what the NCAA did. They did a 3.5-year investigation before making even an allegation against Coach McNair. Not that different than what the committee did. They deliberated for 4 months before they made a finding against Coach McNair. And the other thing about Todd McNair's version of this phone call is that he can't get it straight. In the first interview, he said essentially that he wasn't sure whether or not he talked to Lloyd Lake. He said, "Not to my knowledge." In the second interview, he said definitively, "I don't know them dudes. Don't know Lake, don't know Michaels." And then by the hearing, he says, "Well, I don't remember this, but it must have been about getting on that agent screening meeting in 2009. So let me address that explanation again. I already told you the issue of why somebody who, once again, on a screening meeting would call in the middle of the night. But there's another reason why that doesn't make common sense. In fact, I submit to you that it's a ridiculous explanation. And here's why. What is Lloyd Lake's pitch going to be at that agent panel meeting? What is he going to come in and say? "Hi, I'm Lloyd Lake. I'm going back to jail in 10 days because I broke my girlfriend's arm. Would you please sign up with my agency?" Any one of you could have gone in on January 9th, 2006 and made a better pitch on an agent panel meeting than Lloyd Lake was in a position to. Lloyd Lake's pitch wasn't about what he could do in the future. Lloyd Lake's only pitch was about what he had already done. That he had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars that Bush had given him his word, and that if Bush backed out now, Lake was gonna go to the media. That's not a pitch you can give at a panel. That's not a pitch you give in front of Pete Carroll and other actual agents. That's the kind of pitch you give at 1:30, 1:40, when you pick up the phone and tell Todd McNair this is all gonna go down badly, unless Bush gets the money back. Coach McNair's explanation, the one he came up with many years down the road, makes no sense. And you know other ways in which Coach McNair's story changed over time. In the first interview, he said 5 times that he had next to no contact with Reggie Bush. And when that was revealed to be untrue, 2 years later in the second interview, he said, oh, I didn't understand the contact meant the phone. Judge for yourselves. What we do know is that he had a lot more contact than next to none. And remember, he even tried to blame Reggie Bush for the amount of the calls because he said, well, Bush is not a student of the game, so I have to text him a lot, call him a lot. And oh, he's asked about Mike Ornstein in that first interview. Simple question, how long have you known Mike Ornstein? Let's compare the questions. When he's asked about Bush, how much contact, he says next to none 5 times. And he said, oh, it didn't occur to me that that could have included phone calls. When he's asked about Ornstein, simple question, how much did you know him? He volunteers, I never call him. It's another inconsistency. Why is he talking about calls with Ornstein when he's not even asked, but somehow claims they didn't think the earlier conversation about Bush was about phone calls? Oh, and by the way, he lied about this one too. Ornstein, I never call him. He did call him. We know that. Even onto this witness stand, Coach McNair can't line the story up. In his interview, in one of his staff interviews, he's asked about the Chevy Impala. You remember the Chevy Impala because he kind of suggested that was a piece of junk car and that we were ridiculous for suggesting to him that he should have paid any attention to Reggie Bush having that car. But in the interview, he said, I've been in it, I've seen the inside of it. Here in court, he said, asked, you had been inside of Bush's car, right? 100% false. And then when I followed up with him and reminded him of what he said earlier, then he took that statement back. So you see, on the basic questions, and let me actually go back before I even get to that slide. Let's go back to that bottom line. What's the bottom line that the committee found? Todd McNair knew that these benefits were likely happening, and Todd McNair lied about it. That's the bottom line. That's what they have to prove is false. And I submit to you, they know they cannot prove it. They themselves know they can't satisfy their burden of proof. And so, when you don't have the evidence, you just start making stuff up. I read this jury instruction to you already. Nothing either me or counsel argued to you as evidence. Because we weren't there. We're not witnesses. We're just lawyers. And none of the questions we ask are evidence. We're not here to vouch for something that happened or didn't happen. We don't know any better than you do. But time and again, that's exactly what they did. You remember this suggestion, I'm sure you do, that Lloyd Lake was drunk or high during the call. Who from this witness chair said that? No one. Not Cooper, not Emmert, not Howard, not Sankey, not Ohlendorf, not Najjar, not anyone. Not even Todd McNair, because he doesn't remember the call. The person who kept telling you that is counsel, and he's not a witness. Who suggested the photo was cropped? And we were being polite to say suggestive, because this morning counsel said he was sure that photo was cropped. He's not a witness. He doesn't know whether that photo is cropped any more than the next person who walks in that door. Every witness who was asked about it, none of them said the photo was cropped. It's just speculation. You see, they can't meet their burden on the evidence, so they gotta muddy the water somehow. Now, you know, under the manual that Coach McNair had a responsibility, and it was to tell the truth. To investigators and ultimately at the hearing where it mattered the most. And Eleanor Myers told you, without people telling us the truth, it's very hard to do the job appropriately. And that's again because the NCAA is not the police. The NCAA can't go get a search warrant on Coach McNair. The NCAA can't go tape his phone calls, get a wiretap. The NCAA can't even make Lloyd Lake talk to them if he doesn't feel like it. What the NCAA needs is for coaches to tell them the truth. And they were begging Coach McNair to tell them the truth at the hearing. They weren't out to ruin him. They weren't out to ruin his life. And we know that because we have an example of it. Coach McNair, this is on a separate point, the Marshall Falk party. Coach McNair and his attorney both admitted that Coach McNair lied about the Marshall Falk party. The attorney told, that's Mr. Thompson, he told the committee that that statement about the Marshall Falk party was a false statement by Coach McNair. It wasn't accurate and true. And Coach McNair agreed when I asked him that was false information he had provided. So if these people are there, let's go back to their theory. They want to ruin Coach McNair because it's the only way to bring down USC. Well, if that was their thinking, they've got to be the dumbest bunch of people on the face of the earth, because he just admitted to lying. All they could have said, oh, he lied. We caught him in a lie. He acknowledged to lying. We'll sanction him for that. They gave him a break. Even though they had grave doubts as to his credibility, they didn't find against him. And you know why on that issue? Because they did what they did on all of these issues. They followed the evidence. And if they felt there wasn't enough evidence, they didn't make a finding. Ask yourself this. The committee only made 1 of 3 findings against Coach McNair. If they were trying to railroad him and to use that railroad to bring down USC, why make only 1 of 3 findings? Why? And you know also from this that the committee is not some kind of rubber stamp for the enforcement staff. You heard Ms. Creeders. And let me pause on her for a moment because she was one of the first witnesses, so it's been a little while. You saw her. You judge her professionalism. You judge her attitude. You judge her honesty. But she agreed. Listen, we charge things sometimes and they don't find against us, and it's disappointing, but I respect the committee's decision. And that's what happened in this Marshall Falk party. And here's another point. Another point that's pretty devastating for their case. You see, they make so much of the fact that in the second interview, Coach McNair was asked about the wrong year, January 2005 rather than January 2006. And if that was the last time he had a chance to explain it, I would agree with him. I would agree with him. But he had a chance at the hearing. There was no confusion about the date. There was no confusion about who called who. He got a chance to say his story about the agents in the panel. And again, folks, another thing. On this issue of the mistakes in the questions, as I said, we began this case with a lot of different claims, but the only one that you're asked to decide is defamation. This isn't about whether the interviewer was negligent. This is about whether Coach McNair can prove falsity. And those interview mistakes, they don't help him because he had a chance at the hearing, and that was his best chance to explain. And the problem is that none of these committee members believed him, not a one. His story didn't make sense. Virtually everyone felt he was not credible. They couldn't believe that Mr. McNair forgot a nearly 3-minute call in the middle of the night from a furious Lloyd Lake. I mean, contrast the Lloyd Lake. At times they want to describe Lloyd Lake as one of the worst people you could ever meet. Gangbanger, ex-con, drug dealer. But when they're talking about that call, they want you to think that Lloyd Lake sounded like some professional businessman who said, "Hi, how are you doing this fine 1:30 in the morning? Let me just run a straightforward business proposition by you." The whole story doesn't make sense because the people in it have to be different people from event to event for it to add up. Now, council put this standard up, and I'm not running from it. The committee had to decide, based on evidence that was credible, persuasive, and on a kind of which reasonably proven persons relied. And they did that. And they started by finding that Lake was credible. So I am now in this report. They started by finding that Lake was credible. The committee's report, Exhibit 61. And they started where I started. He was credible because he's the guy who revealed what happened with Bush. And everyone agrees that happened. Gotta give him some credit for that. And then they explained why Coach McNair was not credible. And I didn't actually have space on the slide to include all of those explanations. But if you read from pages 23 to 27 of that report, that's where they're talking about Coach McNair. Paragraph after paragraph after paragraph after paragraph explains why they did not believe him. You can say a lot in a 2.5-minute phone call. And they talked about all the things that Coach McNair denied that just didn't make sense considering the evidence. So this gets me to an important point. Before I get there, let me go back to something the council said because I don't want it to be confusing. When we're talking about the committee's bottom line findings, that Todd McNair knew about these likely violations and that Todd McNair didn't tell the truth, the plaintiff has to prove to you those were wrong. The NCAA has no burden on that. And we're not interested in taking on their burden and shifting it on to us because they're the ones who want $27+ million. But there's another part of their claim here that is really much more technical. It's not about those basic findings. It's about plucking 2 sentences out of this 5-page discussion. And that's really where they put their money down. They say that, this is where they say that the committee made up evidence or changed evidence because of how they describe what Lake said about the phone call. And on this issue, and on only this issue, is the jury instruction that counsel read you relevant. And when they put it up, by the way, they didn't have the second sentence. So I'm going to show you the whole thing. That's the whole instruction. And the point of this instruction is this. When you're talking about something that technical, how you're describing what someone else told the NCAA, the rule is not that it has to be perfect, not that it has to be word for word. The NCAA does not have to prove that the statements were true in every detail, so long as the statements were substantially true. And if that wasn't the law, folks, we wouldn't have newspapers in this country. Because if somebody could go through 7 pages and say, I found 1 sentence is not perfect, sue you for defamation, nobody would publish a thing. So let's look at that. You know, let me stop here because we've talked so much about what Lloyd Lake said about January calls. I want to go back and play it for you, like I did with the speakers. It's a 3-minute clip. Let's hear everything he said about talking to Todd McNair in January of 2006. Let's hear it front to back.
451.
It is your
Let me ask you this one too, Broillet. On January 8th, 2006, at 1:34 in the morning, there's a call, McNair called to you for 2 minutes and 32 seconds.
What time was that?
This is January 8th, 2006. It's at 1:34 in the morning. And it's a call,
Coach doesn't understand why people are calling at 1:34.
McNair makes a call to you at 2:32. I was asleep at that time.
Yeah.
But in your case,
I think that was like him trying to resolve it. You know, like Reggie's wrong, he should make it right. He basically don't implement the school.
because this is 2006 we're talking about.
Yeah, that's when I went to jail, that's when everything started falling apart. I mean, it fell apart.
What can you tell us that you specifically recall about that conversation with him?
He was telling about Reggie and all he knew about the money he took. He knew that he had an agreement. And
Todd McNair indicated to you in the telephone conversation that he was aware that Reggie
I mean,
took money from
he knew Reggie took money from him. There's no doubt he knew about that.
And why do you say that?
Yeah, we need to know why you believe that he knew that.
Because he was around a lot, and you know, it's like, he watched me get them guys, his friends' hotel rooms. Reggie told me he knew about certain things he was doing, but he's cool, you know what I mean? It's like, basically through
Reggie
Reggie.
said he,
Because I told Reggie, you shouldn't be having, you know, he's cool to coach, that's why he's my friend, he's not,
What was your understanding of the relationship that Reggie had with McNair?
I mean, he was his coach, but they were also friends, you know, outside the field.
Did they socialize?
Yeah. That's how we got together that night, I mean. Yeah.
Was there any other occasions besides that,
That date though, Brian,
October 29th?
that party that night, when we went out to eat and all that.
So that October 29th would have been, you know, the day that you thought you were at the game.
Yeah, we were at the game, whoever that was, that's when I was in the locker room, that lets you know exactly who they were playing, all you gotta do is look at their schedule.
Okay, besides that time, you were out with him also at the Marshall Falk party.
Yeah.
McNair.
Yeah.
There. Is there any other times that you were out with McNair?
No, that's it, that's it.
Just those two occasions?
did you ever call McNair?
Yeah, I called him a couple times.
Do you know when or what the?
Around this time,
conversation-
trying to get this resolved, just get my money back and make it right.
So you called McNair in early July and vocalized to him that you wanted your money back? January of 06.
Yeah.
They tried to rip that statement apart in every way they could. And I agree that the interviewer got the direction of the call wrong. But when you listen to it front to back, what the report says about that call, what the report says about Lloyd Lake's description of the call is substantially true. And counsel's argument that there's no evidence here is just beside the point. We're not trying to, it's not our burden to prove that the findings were true. But they're accusing the NCAA of misquoting Lloyd Lake, and we know what Lloyd Lake said. You just heard what he said. And the description, yes, it's a paraphrase. It's true. Angie Creters admitted it's not word for word accurate. But when there's a follow-up question the counsel asked that he didn't read to you, so the report rewrote what Lake had said, actually said, right? I don't believe it was rewritten. Like I said, I think it was paraphrased. It's substantially true. And everyone agreed it was a paraphrase. There were no quotation marks around those sentences in the report. And here's my question to you. What if instead of the paraphrase, they had actually quoted what Lloyd Lake had said? Does anyone think that would have been better for Todd McNair? Does anyone think that we wouldn't be here if they actually quoted Lloyd Lake? Because what Lloyd Lake said was much worse for Coach McNair than just the paraphrase. He said he wanted to let him in on some action. No doubt he knew. Reggie told me that he was cool. So that whole discussion I'm giving you is on question 3. Todd McNair cannot prove to you that the bottom line findings in the report are false. And even if you have some doubt or hesitancy about these 2 sentences that they plucked out, at the very least, they're substantially true. So my argument to you is that when you get to question 3 in the verdict form, you should answer that. You should put your pen down. Because if you answer no doubt, you're not going to have any other questions. And that's true for the first report, and it's true for the second report, because the second report doesn't add anything, it just quotes the first report. And although Mark Emmert should be long gone by this point from your consideration, for some happenstance he's not, he certainly didn't say anything about this. They can't prove that the bottom line is false. And so that's the end of the case. But I wouldn't be doing my job as the NCAA's attorney if I stopped at question 3. Because if they can't prove question 3, some of these other questions, they don't even have a hope of proving. Counsel ran through them at the end of his presentation and just said, oh, check this one, check this one, check this one. I'm going to take some time with them to show you why. So the next question 4, if somehow you're still going, is about something that in the law we call actual malice. Because it's not defamation, even if the NCAA had said something false. It's not defamation unless they knew the statements were false or had serious doubt as to their truth. Serious doubt as to the truth of the findings against Todd McNair. And not only does he have to prove that to you, he has to prove it by clear and convincing evidence. He doesn't have to win the race, he's got to lap us. He's got to blow us out of the water for you to answer yes there. And this again is the definition in the instructions on clear and convincing evidence. So this is where their whole conspiracy theory comes in. They want to say the case was decided about things outside the record, but every single witness you saw said we decided it based on the record. Roscoe Howard was upset that the dog issue wasn't in the record, but he didn't get his way because they didn't put it in the record. No one decided the case on that. What they told you, and this is just a couple of witnesses, but your recollection on all of them controls, is that they decided the case based on the record. And folks, deliberations are a good thing. McNair's counsel wants to make it seem like the fact that they didn't rule against Todd McNair on day 1 is a bad thing. If you were before a committee, would you want them to keep deliberating until every member of that committee felt comfortable with the decision? That's what we want you guys to do. We want you, when you go back in that room, to listen to what every one of you has to say. Consider it. And at the end, all of those voting members made up their own mind, just like we were going to ask you to do. You know, they did some stuff with the table, and it was kind of interesting. The problem was it's another one of these things that's just completely against the evidence. Here's the deliberation, and everyone's in that room, but the voting members are at one table, and these guys are at another. Now, they showed them coming into the table. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that they joined in with the main conversation. And in fact, you heard something very interesting. Remember this email? I'm sure you do, because it's one they talk about a lot. Shep Cooper said, as Roscoe said at some point during Sunday morning deliberations. And they say that's proof that Roscoe talked to the voting members. And Roscoe told the voting members that McNair shouldn't be coaching at any level. Problem is, there's not a single voting member who remembers him saying that. Eleanor Myers never heard that. Neither did Joe Patuto. Neither did the other folks who were asked about it. And what did Eleanor Myers tell you? She told you those guys stayed at the side table. So whatever they're telling themselves in this little conversation isn't heard by these people. That's an example of them taking a snippet out of an email and turning it into something it's not. Turning it into a sound bite instead of assessing the actual elements. Now, they do the same thing with this Roscoe Howard rant email. And I'll be straight with you, it sure was a rant. I mean, I'm not gonna dispute that. But man, nobody was impressed. It was useless, Eleanor Myers said. And here's the thing about Roscoe Howard. And this is maybe one of my favorite points in the case, because it just shows how much they're willing to bend the story even their own story. On the one hand, they say it is an outrage that Roscoe Howard, the observer, hadn't even read the record. Only read the case summary, hadn't read all the submissions. Okay, well, he didn't have a vote, but I get that attack. I get that. On the other hand, you know recklessly constructed record? You've heard that about 1,000 times, give or take, in this case. Roscoe Howard is the one who said that. So they want you, here's their argument to you. Roscoe Howard is a horrible guy because he didn't read the record, and by the way, take it to the bank. Roscoe Howard said the record is recklessly constructed. You gotta believe him on that. That's ridiculous. If he didn't read the record, then why are they relying on him for his description of the record? They know it's ridiculous. But they want to pluck that phrase out from the things around it and just sear it into your mind. And Rod Uphoff, we talked about him, he's the coordinator of appeals. And this is another one of those areas where I just don't even see how their argument relates to what they're asking you to decide. There was, earlier in this case, a breach of contract claim, and so they were talking about what the bylaw said, but you're not being asked to decide that. Meyer said it was helpful to have him there. And here's one of those things they claim is a gotcha moment. Time and again, Rod Uphoff testified from this witness chair. And by the way, he came here. This is a man who knew he was going to be accused of being one of the villains and didn't have to come, and he came. Because he cared enough about the NCAA and the process. And he wasn't afraid to face you. Kept being asked, you wanted to influence the committee. He said, I wanted to help the committee make the right decision. That's not evidence of defamation. Defamation is about intentionally making the wrong decision. And we know because they told you until they were blue in the face that the voting members made up their own mind. They're the ones who say what goes into this report. You're not going to see Roscoe Howard's name on the back here. You're not going to see Shep Cooper's name. You're not going to see Rod Uphoff's name. It's the voting members who are the speakers of this statement, and they acted in good faith. Dr. Thomas told you that nothing Uphoff or Howard or Cooper said changed his decision. So they're calling Dr. Thomas a liar, because for their theory to make sense, these guys would have had to change people's minds. Joe Patuto said that claim is ludicrous. You've seen these people. Do any of them look like the kind of people who don't make up their own mind? You heard Eleanor Myers say she doesn't get bullied. I think that was credible testimony. And then another thing they try to distract you with are these emails that don't have any voting members on them. Or I guess there's one that has Brian Haller, he quickly got out of it. The rest are all between these guys who don't have a vote. How many times did we hear in this case a witness being asked about an email they never saw and never received? How could they have been corrupted by things they didn't get? And the timeline, this is another one of those examples where they only want to focus on things they think help, and they don't want to take a step back and look at the big picture. According to them, everything important that happened between the hearing and this memo and rant emails. Here's the real timeline. They kept deliberating for 2 more months. If Rod Uphoff's email turned people around, if his memo turned people around, or if Roscoe Howard's rant that no one even read all the way through turned people around, why are they talking for another 2 months? They're talking because, as Eleanor Myers told you, they were waiting on the transcript. And that is supported in documents. Counsel made it seem like that was some kind of surprise at trial. It's not. Now, I don't have this in my slide because I didn't know they would make that argument, but you can go ahead and look at Exhibit 17. Eleanor Myers says back in the day, she does say she was having trouble on the record, but she says maybe looking at the transcript will change that. Because the hearing is what matters most to them. That's where Todd McNair had the best chances. And here's another thing, and this is just a distraction, folks. Joe Patuto watched TV 2 years before this hearing. That's the crime there. Now, she told you she has to stay abreast of sports developments and NCAA issues because that's her job in Nebraska. But the other part they don't mention about this is that Joe Patuto would have to be psychic to know this was a problem. Because this was in 2008. There was not even a notice of inquiry or a notice of allegation from the staff. This case was not teed up to the committee. And even if it had been, Joe Patuto wouldn't have given it any thought because she was off the committee by then. This is an example of taking one email out of context and trying to turn it into something that's not. And then the other conspiracy, oh, they were deleting their emails. You heard Eleanor Myers, she's the one who said, let's stop doing this by email. And you heard a reasonable explanation for that. Because she wanted everyone to participate. Some people, like Paul D. and Dennis Thomas, were not sending emails. And she didn't think it was fair to only have the people who like to type a lot weigh in. She wanted everyone to be talking together. And she told you she doesn't remember any emails that are missing. And your common sense tells you that too, because we've seen an email in this case that got Shep Cooper demoted. You think if people were deleting emails, we'd still have that one? And here's the other hole in this idea that the NCAA acted with malice, or that the committee acted with malice, or that anyone acted with malice. There is a hole the size of the Grand Canyon in their story. And the hole is why? Why should all these volunteers from across the country come together to railroad Todd McNair? And so they've come, now they know this is a hole, which is why they've been working so hard to give you something. And the only thing they came up with was, oh, this was a way to ratchet up the penalties on USC. One problem with that argument. There's zero evidence in support of it. No document, no witness, no one says that they increased the penalties based on Todd McNair. Not one bit of evidence, not one document said the reason the penalties went up were because of McNair. You know that none of these people had a motive to rule against Coach McNair. Let me go back there. But beyond that, all the plaintiff has is a timeline. They said at some point the penalties, proposed penalties were lower and then they went up. At some point, they hadn't ruled on McNair and then they did. There's no evidence of a causal connection. Only questions and arguments from counsel. That's it. Now, the one thing they have, you know, they got Dr. Thomas to say in one question and answer his deposition that, oh, maybe McNair was needed somehow in all this to ratchet the penalties. But the very next question, which they didn't show you when they were up there, he said, that's not what I said and that's not what I meant. And here's what he said at trial. Question. I think what you told us was at deposition that, to your knowledge, the committee could not have made the kind of sanctions it issued against USC without finding that Mr. McNair committed misconduct of some sort. Remember that? Answer, Dennis Thomas, under oath, under penalty of perjury, yes, but that's not what I meant. And what he said in his deposition when they tried to clarify it was, quote, no, I didn't say that, nor did I mean it. They depose these people for 8, 9 hours at a time. They get one little soundbite and they say, oh, concession, that's the whole case. And when they try to explain what they meant or what they said, they don't want to hear it. And of course, you know why the penalties went up. We're not making this up for you. This is an email. Brian Halloran, Shep Cooper. The committee decided not to impose a TV ban. That's Exhibit 265, you'll have it. The committee decided not to impose a TV ban, but in lieu of that penalty, upped the other penalties on USC. There's your explanation. This is an email sent at the time. They claim they believe the emails. They don't believe the emails. They just pluck stuff from the emails when it helps them. This email proves, although we don't have a burden of proof, this email proves that the reasons the penalties, the scholarship penalties went up is because they didn't put in a TV ban. And that was sent on May 25th of 2010. And it says that in the report. At page 56, they considered a television ban, decided not to do it. But the other penalties had to be significant. And we asked witnesses every which way, what about the penalties to USC? Ms. Myers has asked, were they enhanced in any way, shape, or form because of the findings as to Coach McNair? No, they were not. Brian Halloran, did you increase the penalty against USC because of the findings against Coach McNair? No, it didn't make any difference. And what did Dr. Thomas, who they supposedly rely on a one-sentence answer in his deposition that he immediately amended? What did he tell you from the witness stand? McNair stood on his own 2 feet, the institution stands on its own. These two things were not linked. And this is another example where you gotta ask yourself, what's the evidence? Sure, we've seen counsel ask every witness in deposition and at trial. No one's actually testified under oath that the penalties against USC were increased because of Todd McNair. Remember, questions are not evidence. Argument is not evidence. You don't take those back with you in the jury room. The counsel in this case are not witnesses to anything. If they're the only people telling you something, it's the same as if no one was telling you that. And another reason why the NCAA and its committees couldn't have acted knowing the statements were false or in reckless disregard of the truth is because there was a whole second committee and a chance for Todd McNair to make all of his arguments again. And I think this is a good stuff.
Okay. So 2:46, we'll take a break.